Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 60. Today we're talking about the dragon and the UFO. I thought we would do this episode kind of around let's call it some crosshairs of Laurence Gardner reading that I started some of the earlier podcasts around that dragon bloodline, but also the way the dragon, we saw how the dragon shows up in many places around not only religious institutions, but also the subversion of them. And then when we're talking about subversions, I think nothing is more subversive in that way than topics that aren't disclosed to us. So we have two great topics that are very much so related. One being, it's the 60th anniversary of the JFK assassination, and also the current events around UFOs and UFO disclosure. And there is a striking similarity between all of these topics. So basically today we're talking about Crossfire and the Invisible College. We're going to be going through 60th anniversary of JFK, talking a bit about the UFO phenomenon, and then looking at the way the dragon fits in with JFK's Camelot, and sort of this blend of the historical and the mythological themes, but also looking at that Invisible College from a UFO point of view, and also from a point of view of, let's say, esoteric or hidden knowledge. So some of the works we've got out on the table today is Jim Marrs. For you guys who don't know Jim Marrs, he is the person who wrote Crossfire, which was maybe the most authoritative book on the plot to kill Kennedy, and it was the inspiration for Oliver Stone's movie JFK. But I've also got a Jim Marrs book out here called Rule by Secrecy, the hidden history that connects the Trilateral Commission, the Freemasons, and the Great Pyramids. So now we've already come in to the Great Pyramids in one book step, right? So I've included here as well the Giza Death Star by Joseph P. Farrell, the Nazi International, post-war plan to control finance, conflict, physics, and space. And thirdly, from Farrell, the Brotherhood of the Bell, which is exotic technology explored by the Third Reich. And then finally, Thrice Great Hermetica in the Janus Age. Again, talking about the influence of Hermeticism and Hermetic cosmology on Middle Ages finance. We've got Jacques Vallee's Invisible College, which we touched on in our last podcast. I want to revisit, and this is sort of what the momentum for this one is. I want to revisit what Jacques Vallee had to say about the Phoenician winged discs and how this kind of could fit into the aerospace story. As we know, JFK was also key in the moon landing. And I think what one of the little or lesser known facts, at least, was that the United States NASA program owed, at least partially to its success, the participation of ex-Third Reicher von Braun. So I think we have a paperclip scientist. I think the great quote is Werner von Braun asked Kennedy, about going to the moon. And I think the paraphrasing of the quote is, "Mr. President, if you ask us to do this, we'll make it so. Don't worry how we're going to do it. We'll figure it out." And again, this is the guy who was part of the Nazi. Von Braun was part of the Nazi V2 program. He was a rocket builder for World War II, and now he becomes an American NASA employee making the rockets that bring us to the moon. And I think this kind of all pulls together with finally the works of Laurence Gardner, because we also have the myth of Camelot that comes with the Kennedy administration, right? So we have Kennedy, there's sort of a concept of Camelot, and this ties us into the idea of how Camelot itself has the Arthur connection, and how that Arthur connection leads us into things like Saint Michael and the dragon, and now we're starting to see a tie back to the Phoenician dragon, right? The winged saucer. Have we been seeing these UFOs forever? So we're going all the way back to Egyptian times, and we also have the idea of the hidden lineage, the invisible college. What is the intersection between UFO disclosure, our true ancient origins? You know, there's a lot of ancient aliens out there talking about this, but also I think that there's a mer de nom, and there's a sort of like sea of names that's out there where the more things are fragmented in the sort of a Tower of Babel kind of way, makes it difficult for us to have a conversation across all these topics. Right, so what we'll kind of do is we'll focus on some ideas, and really a nod goes out to the work that Dark Journalist does over on his YouTube channel. But the idea here is if we see that there's a connection between JFK and aerospace, now suddenly we see two very protected secrets. What's the truth behind the JFK plot? And what's the truth behind UFO disclosure? And we have some linkage points that we can take back to some of this other material. So first off, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Pontos Fathom Press. I will plug some of our books that we've got out there, but if you guys like and subscribe, you can get notified on future episodes. I know a lot of you have been waiting for a follow-up to the Laurence Gardner podcasts. So I'm going to put this out there using Gardner's work also to sort of... Gardner does a great job of weaving through the details of things that might just seem like historical or mythological connections, and sees how that they're really part of an intertwined, let's say, paper trail of maybe a higher order, higher technology. And I think that's intimated by Jim Marrs in his Rule by Secrecy. So some of the odd facts that Marrs brings up. Let's start with the JFK assassination angle. Some of those strange facts that Jim Marrs brings up are around just the number of things that were going on with JFK and who could be the suspects. Now, there's been a lot of false trails around the JFK plot. I mean, obviously we have the official story is the most false of all, but we lead from there into who are the usual suspects, right? And some names come up in this trail. We see Alan Dulles comes up, director of CIA. We have some names, even other odd facts around Oswald being a NASA employee at one point. Also Oswald's involvement in things like Dr. Mary's Monkey, which this is a fascinating book about Oswald's involvement in a doctor trying to weaponize, I believe it's weaponizing, I think that it might have been a CIA plot to kill Castro, but you can see how somehow Oswald is involved with this plot as well. And you start to see that maybe Oswald is more like a double agent or a secret agent, and then he just gets thrown under the bus to be the scapegoat for that likely. But this is a fascinating movie, how the unsolved murder of a doctor in a secret laboratory in New Orleans and a cancer-causing monkey virus is linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global pandemics. This is Dr. Mary's Monkey. Very fascinating. Did inoculating millions of trusting school children with polio vaccines contaminate by a monkey virus trigger an epidemic of soft tissue cancers? What was there a desperate attempt to develop an anti-cancer vaccine diverted secretly into a biological weapon? And what does it have to do around the assassination of JFK? So not only, I'm only bringing this in, is that there's even a biotech angle to it, which kind of would lead us into a bloodline, right? So if you're looking to eradicate something by, I think that the official story that comes out of this book is there's a plot to kill Castro that went wrong, and they might have mutated something, right? So of course, monkeying around with things. But the greater part of it is, I think that some of this ancient bloodlines, Gardner talks a lot about the trail back to, say, the Anunnaki, and suspicion of the Anunnaki being involved in, let's say, steering the genetic products of humanity, right? The human production. Sort of like, think of it in the way of like a Bene Gesserit. They may have been involved in something like this. And, so not only is Jim Marrs giving us the I would say, the authoritative book on exploring inconsistencies with the JFK assassination, but he also gives us something in this book called Rule by Secrecy, which shows us, as we get back through history, there are more and more examples of secret groups that are have their own agenda that may not be fully disclosed to people. Okay, so I think we can start out here with JFK opposed the globalists. So we go to page 126 here. This is in Rule by Secrecy. It says, in 1963, the biggest obstacle to a wider war in Southeast Asia was President JFK, who had already voiced his reservation about U.S. involvement. This is in Vietnam. Democrat JFK upset Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, in the 1960 election, and his top advisors came from those societies. Special advisor Galbraith noted, "Those of us who worked for Kennedy election were tolerating the government for that reason, and had a say, but foreign policy was still with the Council on Foreign Relations. The overabundance of CFR members in government even might be caught attention to President Kennedy was remarked, I'd like to have some new faces here, but all I get is the same old faces." So immediately after his election, Kennedy was faced with a confrontation in Laos. In a foretaste of Vietnam, the conflict in Laos against the CIA-backed government, and we kind of go through this. 1954, just 4 months after the fall, Secretary of State John Dulles, founder of the CIR, John Dulles might sound familiar. John Dulles' brother was CFR founder and CIA director Alan Dulles, who we've kind of mentioned before. They resulted in basically setting the stage to get us prepared to enter war. So this is sort of in the books. So you sort of have this conflict of entering the war and versus not entering the war. And then linking into that is the military contracts and weapons that kind of come into this. So if you look to the idea of how we can get to a UFO space, 145, Jim Marrs talks about it's hard to believe, as it may be for Americans brought up on the wartime propaganda films of World War II. Well, World War II is largely the result of infighting between occult societies composed of wealthy businessmen and eventually led to international tensions that provoked open warfare. Sir Winston Churchill himself was insistent that the occultism of the Nazi Party should not be under any circumstance be revealed to the general public, wrote author Trevor Ravenscroft, who worked closely with Dr. Walter Johann Stein as an advisor to Churchill. The failure of the Nuremberg trials to identify the nature of the evil at work behind the outer facade of National Socialism convinced him that another 3 decades must pass before a large enough readership will be present to comprehend the initiation rites and black magic practices of the inner core of the National Socialist leadership. So part of this we see is things like the Protocols of the Learned Men of Zion, which, you know, someone like a William Cooper would talk about. William Cooper talks about this idea of these protocols that are basically the idea of rules set up to keep the world population subjugated by a sort of world order. And some of this material also links into our UFO topic, which will come up soon enough, because William Cooper was also a ex-Air Force UFO enthusiast, let's call him. So maybe here's a good place to sort of pull in. So you said this differing, you've got the Dulleses trying to get Kennedy into war. Kennedy's resistant to war. And you also have some aerospace connections potentially around the military contracts. But one thing I thought was interesting in this biography of Dulles, this is Alan Dulles, Master of Spies. He said Dulles taking command of the East Bay. Now this is after this is before the Kennedy assassination. Already the CIA director. It says, what Dulles was about to do was to take the foundation stones that had put in place by himself and others and erect a service that transcended procedures and physical facilities. Under Dulles, the CIA became a culture of its own. His agency's pseudonym for cable purposes, Ascham, delighted him when he learned from a CIA official biographer, Wayne Jackson, that Herodotus in his histories had written about a warrior class that served the Egyptian pharaoh Pasmedicus. Asham in Greek meant those who stand on the left hand of the king. Well, this could also be the left hand of God, right? I don't know, which has a sinister sound to it. The fit in with Dulles' own image of elite status he wanted for his agencies. The spy had come a long way from the back alleys. Under Dulles, espionage moved up the ladder rung to the honorable government services that Donovan had decreed. Right? So now we've got this linkage back to the ancient left hand of the king. Interesting, right? Which king is he serving, though? Also, I just wanted to call out some of these rocket work from Dulles. It says one of the focal points of Eisenhower's attention became the U-2 program. Khrushchev began ordering a diminishing number of the offensive overflights. These are U-2 flights. These U-2s, should the U-2s crash within Soviet borders, those fears increased as information came in detailing the rapid advance of Russians were making in radar-guided anti-aircraft missile technology. Right? So the hopes of the administration in 58, 59 was to close the missile gap. Right, so they wanted the White House, after an 8-year absence, the missile gap became a frightening public image and a valuable political weapon for leading Democratic hopefuls. So the idea here is the missile gap is the USSR is developing missiles faster than the US is. And this sort of leads to that kind of the Cold War escalation of missiles. But now we talk about missiles now, we're right back to Wernher von Braun. Right? So Wernher von Braun, National Socialist, brought over to America, works for NASA. And now we suddenly have this link back to JFK's successful moon program, which some sources say that JFK wanted it to be a global program where he would share information with the Russians, which would be against sort of the idea of the left hand of the king's, Alan Dulles' view of American hegemony, right? And I think some of this also will take us into this concept of, maybe the messianic legacy of Michael Bajan and Richard Lee and Henry Lincoln. So this is the idea of, we can talk about that a bit when we talk about Camelot. So, what's the story here with the aerospace connection? Well, let's take a detour here. Instead of going with the typical rockets and rocket technology, and also the 1947 founding of the CIA, which coincides with the Roswell 1947, let's kind of go back to Jacques Vallee's Phoenician winged saucers. So if we go into here, and we shared this last time. So the Phoenician amulets. So one of the things that the Phoenicians are taught to us, let's say in our education, is their invention of our alphabet. So the current alphabet we use in English kind of comes from the Phoenician use of, and so it's basically a predecessor of Greek and of Latin written language. And it may either have been derived from Babylonian characters or from Egyptian hieroglyphs, but also in the Phoenician archaeology, let's call it. There's also but we don't hear much about what were the Phoenicians' religious beliefs, what were their cultural beliefs, and little is known about this. Of their ritual practices, we are told that they sacrificed children in time of trouble. Similarly, they killed prisoners of war on the altars of the gods. That their women surrendered in the sanctuary of Astarte. And they also have some magical items. Some of those artifacts are these cylinders. 5 of these cylinders are in the British Museum. They date from about 300 to 400 BC. All 5 of the cylinder seals depict the winged disc, often with appendages. And this is our first sort of reference to something that's dragon-like, right? So the winged disc, figures which are referred to in the literature as divine beings are seen emerging from these discs in 4 cases. And each one of the human figures in ceremonial dress appear to be involved with Assyrian features. So now you have Phoenicians showing Assyrians, and we have the cylinder shows a hero holding up each hand with a foreleg of a beast. One of the 2 beasts has horns on its head, and above the human being of the winged beast from the god is emerging Ahura Mazda, or some Assyrian god. In Wallace Budge's book Amulets and Superstition, the inscription reads, belonging to Plethon. The 2 winged figures, classically interrupted as priests wearing winged garment, frame a large disc with extended legs. Directly beneath the disc is a symbol of lightning and thunderbolts. And there's a man appeared to be standing in adoration. There is something on top of the disc which is interpreted with a lion's head, and the inscription reads, Yerpal, son of Herod. Now you see the disc is sort of going up with some kind of lightning. There's is that a DNA strand beneath the disc? And now we have some energy source, exotic technology perhaps. A sphinx and a goat stand on either side of the sacred tree, which is the winged disc. 2 men are performing a ritual in connection with the scene. There's these chimeras beneath it. Again, the 2 strange dwarfish figures, scorpion men, are supporting the winged disc from the project of the head's being, these 2. They're in our adoration before the disc. Beneath the sort of vaulted door can be seen a god holding a gazelle or a goat in each arm. Tempting as it is, the speculation, this is Jacques Vallee now, tempting as the speculation does not answer all our questions. It's certainly fascinating to read the best accepted interpretation of the symbols. But why should a thunderbolt be associated with a winged disc? The scene suggests a plan and purpose rather than a chance occurrence. Equally fascinating to the student of close encounter UFO cases are the scenes in which animals are carried into the hovering disc, reminiscent of animal kidnapping by UFOs. The the beings themselves fall into these categories. Human beings that Assyriologists would call worshippers, priests, or kings. We talked about the left hand of the king. Right? The gods, they are shown emerging from the disc. The scorpion men, who are supporting the disc, and various monsters, a sphinx. If we assume that the Phoenicians were thus transmitting recent or ancient knowledge of the details of a UFO landing, why should such knowledge be preserved in seals rather than other types of inscriptions? Representation of flying discs does not stop with the Phoenicians. The symbol of the basic one of the Christian church, Muslims. According to Japanese researcher Matsumura, the religious Sophia, a written document claiming upon the dogma of the Greek Orthodox Church, preserved in Leningrad, describes the process of communicating between gods and the angels. And it says, how does the Lord guide his angel? If the angel cannot see the face of the Lord, an angel has a projection on the upper part of his eyes, where the sacred cloud rests. He has also a thing to receive sounds on his head. This thing makes noises as an angel receives an order to go from his Lord. Then he quickly looks at the mirror in his hand, and he gets in the mirror something on which are the instructions from God given. I've not been able to verify directly the existence of this document or the accuracy of the translation, but it's consistent with a number of paintings, icons, and murals. Basically, it's like a helmet with some kind of tablet or screen. So you get some interesting stuff when you get into Jacques Vallee and the UFO space, right? But one thing that introduces us here to the concept of the blurring of the names, right? So if there's a question that the winged disc could be called an angel, other winged things now can come into play. And now we have this long tradition of dragons. So again, we have the kings, of which we'll just kind of throw out there that by calling Kennedy's reign the reign of a modern American Camelot, we're sort of building a mythology of Kennedy as a kind of a tragic Arthurian figure, right? Who's in the crossfire, right? That would make a great dragon name, wouldn't it? Crossfire, right? But the cross hairs, right? It's also like the crosshairs of the Tic Tac video, right? So you put things in the crosshairs, and now they're under scrutiny, or they're targets, right? And I think we have our Christian cross with the with Christ being somewhat placed in that same space. Gardner also has some ancient UFO type plates in this book. One of them is his, I think it's in this one, Genesis of the Grail Kings. Yeah, so in Genesis of the Grail Kings, Peter Robeson has this image of the Ezekiel's vision. Again, another UFO vision, Ezekiel's wheel. I remember from the old Project Blue Book television show from the 70s. It started out with the words, Ezekiel saw the wheel. Is this the wheel he said he saw, right? And they're broadcasting this program on national TV. Ezekiel saw the wheel. Is this the wheel he said he saw? And if we look at things like Ezekiel, it leads us back into this biblical tradition, which is also a Sumerian tradition, and it's translated from Anunnaki through to the Exodus of the Old Testament culture. So a lot of that crosses over. But if we're talking about the idea of a Camelot, now we can bring in things about King Arthur himself. So again, we have this concept of the sword and the stone. I think in Realms of the Ring Lord, we touch on a lot of this knowledge here. So there's a section here I'd like to share in which he talks about Camelot and the Arthurian legends. And I think it's important to think about this concept of Kennedy as a kind of experiment of a Camelot, 98 to 102, right? So I think that this is a Camelot that was not allowed to happen, right? 98 to 102. The rings in Camelot. Okay, so first of all, back to the winged dragon, we have the Pendragons. So before we get to Camelot, we have Pendragons. Right, because King Arthur's senior descent in the Albigensian lines of the Milesian Scots in the Grail House of Avalon de Acre has tradition suffered in much the same way as that of the Melusine, with various knightly dynasties claiming the fictitious descent from him. Arthur's father was named the 18th Pendragon of Britain, who was dubbed the Terrible Pendragon, the Uther Pendragon, right? So this Uther Pendragon, and we can get back into that dragon mythology, but now we start to see that there's a dragon mythology that brings justification of the name Camelot. Right, so Uther, but now it's perhaps now just like the American experiment itself, which was one not based on necessarily the bloodlines, but more on the let's say the ideological lines. Like so, the democratic ideological lines of its origins, the breaking with England, all of this is an ideological one. So, in a way, it's a virtual version of a bloodline. I'm not claiming that Kennedy has some connection to it, but by calling it Camelot, we bring into play all of this Camelot mythology. So we say the rings of Camelot, the Arthurian court of Camelot, as first mention of Camelot as the royal court of the King Arthur was in the tale of Lancelot, the Chevalier de la Charette, produced by Chrétien de Troyes in about 1135. Historically, the place first recorded as Camelot, or more correctly, Camelot, was the ancient city of Colchester in the east of Britain. It was the seat of the very first Pendragon of Britain, King Cymbeline, who governed the Catulavellani and Trinovite tribes from the most impressive hill fort of the land. The writings of Chrétien de Troyes, King Arthur had an alchemical court of curved light, Camelot, at Carlisle in Cumbrian North Country. So here we're starting to look at the idea of some kind of physics. We have a curved light. The British Pendragons, the kings of kings, were not successive heirs, but were appointed from an overall Gaelic stock, Kennedy is Irish, by a Druidic council of elders in descent from the sovereign woodlord. Throughout the centuries, much has been made of the harmonious concept of King Arthur's Round Table, and many thousand people traveled from the world to see the replicated specimens at Winchester. All the representative customs of the culture from the earliest Scythian kings and their social structure were firmly centered around designated seats of the assembly, which became known as fairy rings. So now we're going to get into rings. Like we're talking about saucers are circular, now we're getting into rings. On the account, and the round table is round, circular. Raths, they're known as. The royal seats from Scythia to Ireland were known as raths, which are denoted as round or circular. And on the account, the round table of Arthurian romance was designated to symbolize this fairy ring concept. The land fell into waste and chaos when the power of the ring was usurped by the virtue of Queen Guinevere being unfaithful to Arthur with Lancelot. So the power of Camelot diminished with the subverting of the dream of Camelot, which Arthur stood to represent. So when we go back to, if we go back to, just take a pause here, we're going back to Jim Marrs' sort of like rule by secrecy, the idea that the work cannot allow it to be continued. We kind of get into that works of Joseph P. Farrell. And so Farrell starts us out, maybe one of his books are Exotic Materials. Was the SS looking to create some kind of some kind of exotic material? Does it have something to do with UFO investigation, or is it is it some kind of UFO technology? It says, what was the bell? What new physics might they have been discovering and working with? In this book, alternative science and history researcher Joseph P. Farrell reveals a range of exotic technologies that were being researched by the National Socialists and the challenges that they found. The conventional views of the end of World War II, the Roswell incident, and the beginning of the Magic 12, the government's alleged secret team of UFO investigators. So suddenly we see the continuing of the work of the continuing of the work of this Brotherhood of the Bell may have something to do with anti-gravity technology. So we have this evidence that's brought in for analysis around the examination of Corso's The Day After Roswell in the light of the Cooper Cantwell documents. It says, Corso's thesis bears once again repeating. My boss, General Trudeau, asked me to use the Army's ongoing weapons development and research program as a way to filter the Roswell technology into the mainstream of industrial development through the military defense contracting program. Well, here we have a footnote here. Let's just talk about the military defense contracting program that was at risk with JFK being reluctant to go into war in Southeast Asia, right? So it's an evidence trail. And also we've called in the left hand of the king. Which king is that? Because it's not King Arthur. Today, items such as the lasers, integrated circuitry, fiber optics networks, accelerated particle beams, and even the Kevlar material in bulletproof vests are all commonplace. Yet the seeds for all of them were founded in the crash of the craft in Roswell and turned up in my files 14 years later. This is Philip Corso, The Day After Roswell, from his book. Elements of this thesis may be broken down the following list. Something crashed in New Mexico. It was recovered by U.S. Army Air Force. Oh, by the way, in 1947, it crashed, the same year that the CIA was founded, by Allen Dulles. It contained exotic technology of such a nature as to compel the interpretation of what crashed was extraterrestrial in origin, and the recovery of this technology was the crash from black engineered and led to the ET-derived technology of one, the integrated circuit, and by implication, its forerunner, the transistor, the laser, fiber optics, particle beams, and particle accelerators. Okay, so what is this? What Corso is sort of implying here is the actual technological leap is ET-derived technologies. So this technological jump forward, now when we talk about landing on the moon, both the Americans and the Russians were in a space race to get to the moon. And who was Kennedy's advisor? It was Wernher von Braun, right? So if we take a look at another book by Joseph Farrell, I believe this one will show us a picture of von Braun. Maybe not in this one, but the idea here is we are rapidly starting to see. Here we go, back to Dulles. We'll go with this one instead. We're rapidly starting to see the idea of a connection between technology, any anti-war movement, because we need the war machine to have the black budgets to run this technology. So here we go. Allen Dulles' comment to Paul Manning. Paul Manning makes one highly significant comment in the acknowledgement section of his book on Martin Bormann, I guess it is. To Allen Dulles for his encouragement and assistance, I was on the right track and should keep going. After reading my German research notes in preparation for this book, during the afternoons we talked in the house on Q Street in Washington, D.C. Dulles ought to have known, since he was in part instigated the CIA's search for Bormann via his ostensible control over General Galen's organization in Eastern Europe, and later the CIA, of which Dulles was the one-time director, until becoming dismissed by President JFK for his part in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. The CIA pressured Galen. So basically, JFK dismissed him, who thought he was Asham the left hand of the king, right? So Dulles sees himself as the left hand of the king, and he's been dismissed. The U.S. CIA, on the other hand, theorized that the Reichsleiter had succumbed to shell fire as they fled the bunker, staunchly insisting that was so. The CIA, for some unexplained political reasons, advanced, promoted, and encouraged this belief. They intervened, for instance, with General Reinhard Gehlen, and it kind of goes into the CIA making a statement about Martin Bormann and relations with U.S. versus Soviet technology. The CIA, through Dulles' private comments demanding, was wanting to have both ways, publicly insisting on the truthfulness of the standard version of history that Bormann, along with Heinrich Müller, perished during the attempts to escape Berlin, but then also encouraging that he was on the right track. So this again goes to the concept of both the U.S. and the Soviets collecting scientists who had been involved in the rocket programs. Now, the thing is, why stop at the rocket programs? I think Farrell has a deep catalog of books, and I see his serve as a successor even beyond maybe of Jim Marrs, the late Jim Marrs. But if we keep going back through Farrell's research, you start to see that it's not just current view of technology. The idea of actually physics and linkage back to things like the Hermetica was even at the core of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So how can we have Middle Ages and Renaissance technology links? Where do we see the codes for this? We don't see the technology. I mean, obviously there's military technology, but not of the flying sort, right? And this takes us all the way back to Farrell's view on the Giza Death Star, where he believes or purports some very interesting things, and maybe we'll do a podcast on the works of Dr. Farrell. What is the real aspect of the Great Pyramids, and was it some kind of technology? We see this come up even in Jim Marrs. I mean, if we look back to Jim Marrs in the Rule by Secrecy, Jim Marrs says in the section on All Roads Lead to Sumer, 374, that maybe it's all kind of Hermeticism, right? So he starts at the Bible without question, the most influential book ever produced, was written by men with secrets to conceal both from the Romans and the Jewish authorities. So our religions may be just concealing secrets by letting truths come through, right? We see here talk of Gardner's works. It says about the Essenes. It says, according to Gardner, the Essenes were connected to esoteric healing traditions, later branch of an Egyptian mystery school called the Great White Brotherhood of the Therapeutate. This was a peaceful organization of healers, right? The original Rosicrucians that Jesus was initiated from to progress through the degrees to his standing in the reign, which gained him the often designation of master. Other authors also state that he was an Essene. And, if we go into the works of Gardner, he also talks about maybe that the carpenter is a misnamed word. It's a mistranslation. Jesus wasn't a carpenter, but he was a master of the craft. And I think that craft could be this order of Melchizedek. It was generally supposed that the Essenes were the custodians of esoteric knowledge and the initiators and educators of Jesus, wrote Hall. So if Jesus was undoubtedly initiated to the same temple of Melchizedek, where Pythagoras had studied, the Bible tends to confirm this in Hebrews. Gardner claimed the name Melchizedek, according to the most mysterious person in the Bible, an Essene composite of the Archangel Michael and the Hebrew priest of Zadok. The Michael Zadok, right? That might be the origins of Melchizedek. And it may be the Sumerian deity Enki. So again, now you can see that encoded within just simple things like the paper trail, let's call it, the paper trail back to the idea of even the origins of the other great person in the crosshairs, in the crossfire, right? Even he was perhaps part of this deeper tradition. And I think no one does this better than Gardner. In his Genesis of the Grail Kings, let's say, he'll go into the realm of the angels and how this tradition really was, perhaps it wasn't angelic. And this is where we get into the idea of the winged angels and the winged dragon, right? So the idea here is with the winged dragon, and we've done a number of podcasts on the dragon. I think one of the ones that I found that no one else has sort of talked about, and I think you guys would be interested to go back and check this out, is the one in which we talk about the dragon as the, maybe this is also something of a analog for a kind of a UFO thing. You know, we talked about fairy ring, but what about the winged dragon? And I think in our one of the ones we do have a podcast on the Laurence Gardner books, but the one I think that is really key is when we look at the dragon and the cross, because again now we start to see this link between the crossfire, the crosshairs, the UFO in the crosshairs, Kennedy in the crossfire, Jesus on the cross. And, you know, if you go back to the works of dark journals I mentioned, they talk about ex-protect, which is this idea of some secrets have to be kept and others are public, but they're done in such a way that they are have to be inferred. So if we look at this realm of the angels and we kind of tie that into the dragons, if the angels were not giants, and if they were not Bene Ha-Elohim, the sons of the gods and goddesses, what were they? As related in the bloodline of the Holy Grail, the first thing to consider is that there's nothing spiritual or ethereal about the word angel. In the Greek form, the definition angelos is translated from the Hebrew word malath, which means messenger. And this sounds like angle and math to me, right? So just calling that out, right? Which is measuring, right? Which can be interpreted in many ways, but part and parcel of the key of exotic technology is just the idea of measuring and taking account for it and naming it, right? The modern English language derives the word angle from the Latin, but the Anglo-Saxon word angle comes originally from the Old French angel. The angel of the Lord was therefore a messenger of the Lord, or more correctly, an ambassador of the Lord. So this is an ambassadorship, something that comes down to land to the Lord. And again, we have this idea of the descending Ezekiel's vision. We saw Peter Robeson's painting again of the Ezekiel's vision. In Isaiah 6:12, there's a similar account of airborne throne above which stands the seraphim. Each one has 6 wings. Yet another reference of the apparatus occurs in Ezekiel 1, where the whole scenario so vividly depicted in Sir Peter Robeson's painting Ezekiel's vision is entirely in keeping with the other. The prophet Ezekiel explains that while among the Israelite captivities in Babylonia, a great whirlwind came out of the north, spreading fire. Out of the brightness flew, which appeared to be 4 living creatures, each with 4 wings, straight feet, shining like burnished brass. Their wings set were joined together, and the creatures displayed on their side with the faces of a man, an ox, a lion, and an eagle. There were ultimately rotating rings above them, noisy like rushing waters, while the creatures, green as beryl, appeared to be full of eyes. They also had wheels which folded them among the flying. But when they stood, they let down their wings, and as Ezekiel saw that within each lighted firmament, a throne with the appearance of a man was upon it. Unrelated to the Bible, but very similar to the concept of the Ezekiel story, is the ancient tractate from 3rd century Alexandria entitled The Origin. It tells of the immortal Sophia, one of the rulers of the Sabaoth, who created a great throne of a 4-faced chariot called cherubim. And on the throne, he created some other dragon-shaped seraphim. Now we're returning to the flaming snake, right? Flaming seraphims, dragons, with regularity in ancient documents, they are fiery and consistent with the etymology of the word seraph, which is related to an old Hebrew stem meaning of flame. So the Lord sent fiery serpents, seraphs, among them. From the same period, accounts come from Tibet, India, and Scandinavia of fiery, dragon-shaped seraphim with wings. And they were never at any time described as having human form as angels always were. They were a fearful dogma of later religious establishment. So this is an interesting link, right? So now we're seeing that there's a link in your readings. Let's leave it at this. In your readings, when you get to UFO, what I'm curious, and you guys can leave comments below what you think. What I'm curious is, where will you see the intersections when you think of it as a creative exercise? Let's say you're writing a science fiction novel in which you want to link dragons with UFOs, okay? And let's say every time you're doing your research, when you come up with a winged thing or an angel or a flying demon, I want you to sort of cross your eyes a little bit. I want you to sort of blur the concept and think about this history trail, this sort of broken hegemony of history that keeps getting rewritten every 500 or so years with new names for everything. And yet the symbology of everything stands the same. And I want you to look at this in the crosshairs of this as something that may give you insights into this ancient, let's say, dragon story. If we go back to the oldest of it, when we think of the idea of the dragon itself, we can go to from the very earliest recorded time. Dragons have been featured in the forefront of cultural lore. So instead of the winged disc, right, that we have from the Phoenicians, let's have the winged dragon step in here. By studying pre-biblical texts concerning the Old Testament, the answers to these questions are stunningly revealed. No longer are Adam, Noah, Abraham, and the well-known characters of Genesis a humble band of territorial pioneers. Instead, they emerged as a formidable cast of players in one of history's most enlightening portrayals, for it is they who witnessed the astonishing dawn of the Grail Kings and the original House of the Dragon. To the Celtic race of Europe, Celtic being Irish, right, to some degree, in the Franks and in this area, the northwestern Europe and British Isles. The dragon was the ultimate symbol of sovereignty, hence the Dark Age Pendragons, the head of dragons, or the king of kings. But in AD 494, Pope Gelasius challenged the Celtic Church by canonizing a certain bishop, George of Alexandria, who was said to have slain a dragon. This is interesting. The violent and unpopular Turkish churchman is reputed to have insulted and persecuted dissenters and was eventually killed by a Palestinian mob in AD 361. He emerged, however, as the famous martyr Saint George. Interesting, isn't this? Is this the left hand of the king that Dulles was on about? Very interesting. So it's like a force and a counterforce, right? And this kind of leads back to, if you go watch that other podcast, The Dragon and the Cross, I go quite deep into this concept of why slay the dragon? Why not ride the dragon? Why not tame the dragon? Why not see the... why has the dragon been ostracized from our imagination in this weird way? I mean, you even see Jordan Peterson saying, we have to slay our dragons, really? Who's a slayer out there? Who's slaying things anymore, right? From the 4th century, the Roman Church denounced and terrorized upholders of the Celtic Christian faith. So the old ways were denounced. In this regard, George the Dragon Slayer personified the vengeful Catholic Inquisition against the supporters of the Messianic bloodline. And the dragons of Christian mythology were adopted from those of the Hebrew tradition and are often portrayed by wings and breathing fire, but historically dragons were the epitome of the royal crocodile or sea serpent, the Bestia Neptunus of the Dark Age Fisher Kings, and the medieval Merovingian kings of the Frank. By way of a manipulated tradition in Western Christendom, the dragon has been portrayed rather differently from its original representation in Eastern cultures. It may have been diverted into the realm of legends and mythology, whereas it was the fact the historical Messiah or Mishus, the sacred dragon or crocodile, that the Egyptian pharaohs and Mesopotamian kings were anointed upon installation. So I think this kind of brings us full circle to why I was talking about the Messianic legacy. Messianic legacy. This is the sequel to Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which I think influences Gardner. It's kind of one of the... But this is a more political turn of that. It's a more political version of it. The Messianic legacy, kind of talking about the artifacts that are leading us to what the Messiah really was. And I kind of want to maybe just end this with the secret power behind covert groups. The idea here is, just like Jim Marrs points out in The Rule of Secrecy, what is this Messiah movement? And, when we think of the sacrificial aspect of the Messiah, right? We think of the sacrificial idea of Christ on the cross. We think of the idea of someone in the crossfire, of maybe a left-hand path or a right-hand path. So Dulles perhaps self-naming himself on the left-hand path. Can we kind of see Kennedy on that right-hand path, and for that reason, things were not allowed to progress? Interesting stuff, but maybe I'll just leave it at that. You guys can make your own conclusions. Let me down in the comments. Before I let everyone go, hopefully this was an interesting one for you. I want to do a quick shout out to some of the books that we've got out there on Pontos Fathom Press. We've got William Mitchell's Alchemy and Anthroposophy and the Dune Saga. This is a deep dive into Steiner's Anthroposophy and Alchemy, and why it resonates in Frank Herbert's Dune Saga. Quite interesting, I believe. Also got the Katsu Journals out of Lovecraft's Providence. We go into lots of topics using, I would say this mostly uses the idea of the Lovecraft lore as a way to look into things like anthroposophy, occultism, esoteric knowledge that maybe Lovecraft was just a sensitive and he was able to do it, but it's almost in the form of a grimoire. Finally, Artificial Psychoanalysis of Desiring Machines, Pontos Fathom Press edition, collecting the 3 volumes of Impedance and Admittance in Desiring Machines, Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence and Computational Complexity. We've also got, if you go check out our bookstore link below, we've got the first 3 books of our podcast series. I've turned them into book form, so I can show you some of those as well. I am working on the 4th volume, which will be called, which will have to do with the dragon. So the 4th volume will be relating to the dragons, and I think I'll probably also do a collected hardcover edition. But we've got Esoteric Anthroposophy and Occulted History, Bruno, Tolkien, Kubo, Saturn, Time, Atlantis. We've got Volume 2, Theosophical Psychoanalysis of Pulp Fantasy and Fiction. And finally, Jungian Alchemy in Horror and Science Fiction. These will eventually have a 4th volume having to do with the Dragon series. And by all means, if you are more of a fan of listening to the podcast, go out and check our Dragon playlist. I'll put a link down in the description to the Dragon playlist. You can check out all of these lectures as a group. And you can also go check out our Patreon. For as little as $1, you can support us over there. And as usual, liking, subscribing. I read all the comments. Let's get together on this, and looking forward to doing some more of these. Join us in about 2 more weeks. I'll be putting out another podcast. I'm sure something interesting for you guys. But go and check the back catalog if it's your first time here, and thanks for watching. Talk to everyone soon. Have a great week. Bye-bye.